Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your salary for the next 10 years has already been spent. Not by you, by your government. That is not a metaphor. It is not exaggeration. It is not a dystopian movie plot. It is the basic operating system of the modern global economy. We call it debt, and almost every country on Earth is running on it. Right now, governments around the world owe more than $300 trillion combined. That number is so large it stops feeling real. It is bigger than the entire global economy, bigger than all annual goods and services produced on the planet. The world, collectively, has borrowed from tomorrow to survive today. But here is the uncomfortable part. Tomorrow has not agreed to this. So how did we get here? Why does the system rely on borrowing from a future that does not exist yet? And what happens if that future does not show up the way we expect? To understand this, we need to start with a simple idea. When a government spends more than it collects in taxes, it has a deficit. To cover that deficit, it borrows, usually by issuing bonds. These are IOUs. The government promises to pay back the money later with interest. Investors buy these bonds. Banks buy them. Pension funds buy them. Foreign governments buy them. In exchange, they get a relatively safe return. At least that is the theory. Take the United States. The federal government owes over $34 trillion. It finances that debt by selling treasury bonds. Countries like Japan and China hold large amounts of those bonds. American pension funds hold them. Your retirement account might hold them. So when the U.S. borrows money, it is not borrowing from some abstract void. It is borrowing from its citizens, its institutions, and other nations. But here is the twist. It is also borrowing from people who are not born yet. Because debt does not disappear. It rolls forward. If a government cannot pay off its old debt with tax revenue, it issues new debt. To pay the interest on old debt, it may borrow again. This is not a rare emergency strategy. It is standard practice. The system assumes one thing: the future will be richer than the present. If the economy keeps growing, tomorrow's taxpayers will earn more money. Higher incomes mean higher tax revenues. That makes today's debt manageable. In theory, this assumption is the quiet pillar holding up the entire structure. Now zoom out. After the 2008 financial crisis, governments borrowed heavily to stabilize collapsing banks and shrinking economies. Interest rates were pushed near zero. Central banks flooded markets with liquidity. Debt became cheap, almost free. Then came 2020. The pandemic shut down the global economy. Governments responded with massive stimulus programs. Trillions of dollars were created, borrowed, and spent to keep businesses alive and households afloat. In the United States, stimulus packages totaled several $trillion in just a few months. Europe did the same. Japan expanded its already enormous debt load. Emerging markets borrowed aggressively to avoid economic collapse. At the time, it felt necessary, and perhaps it was. But the bill did not disappear. It was simply moved forward. Now interest rates are rising. Inflation forced central banks to tighten policy. Borrowing is no longer cheap. Servicing debt is becoming expensive. And this is where the math starts to bite. If a government owes trillions and interest rates rise from 1% to 5%, the cost of servicing that debt explodes. Suddenly, a large portion of tax revenue goes not to schools, not to healthcare, not to infrastructure, but to paying interest on past decisions. It is like putting more and more of your monthly paycheck toward credit card interest, instead of groceries or rent, except on a national scale. Here is where things become quietly surreal. Some countries now spend more on interest payments than on defense, or education, or social programs. Entire generations are effectively working to service yesterday's spending. And yet, markets still lend. Why? Because sovereign debt, especially from powerful economies, is seen as safe. The US dollar remains the global reserve currency. U.S. Treasuries are considered one of the safest assets in the world. As long as investors believe the government can tax, print money, or grow its way out of trouble, they keep buying. Confidence is the oxygen of this system. But confidence is fragile. If investors begin to doubt that growth will outpace debt, yields rise. Higher yields mean higher interest costs. Higher interest costs mean larger deficits. Larger deficits require more borrowing. You can see the loop. Now let's step into a more uncomfortable layer. Debt is not just a government problem. Corporations borrow heavily. Households borrow. Students borrow. Entire economies are layered in obligations. Global corporate debt has surged over the last 2 decades. Cheap money encouraged companies to issue bonds for expansion, stock buybacks, and acquisitions. Households took mortgages at historically low rates. Investors piled into assets. When money is cheap, borrowing feels rational, sensible even. But cheap money is a temporary condition. Debt is not. And here is the irony. Modern economic growth depends on debt. When you take out a mortgage to buy a house, that creates demand. Construction jobs, materials, furniture sales, economic activity. When a company borrows to build a factory, that creates employment and output. Debt pulls future consumption into the present. That is its superpower. It allows economies to grow faster than their current savings would permit. But that same superpower is also a liability. Because if too much of tomorrow's income has already been promised to repay yesterday's borrowing, the future becomes constrained. Growth slows, spending tightens, investment declines. It is like constantly fast-forwarding a movie to enjoy the climax now, only to realize there is nothing left to watch later. So how do governments manage this balancing act? There are only a few real options. First, growth. If the economy expands rapidly, debt becomes smaller relative to GDP. This is what happened after World War II. The United States had massive debt from wartime spending. But strong post-war growth reduced the debt-to-GDP ratio over time. Second, inflation. Inflation erodes the real value of debt. If prices and wages rise, the fixed nominal debt becomes easier to service. This is a quiet, politically convenient way to reduce the burden. Third, austerity. Governments can cut spending and raise taxes to reduce deficits. This is painful and often unpopular. Can slow growth, at least in the short term. Fourth, default. The most dramatic option. Refusing to pay. This damages credibility and can trigger financial chaos. Most developed nations avoid default at all costs. Instead, they rely on a mix of growth, moderate inflation, and continued borrowing. Notice what is missing. There is no easy, painless reset. The system works as long as the future is bigger than the present. But demographics are shifting. Many advanced economies have aging populations. Fewer workers support more retirees. Healthcare and pension costs are rising. Productivity growth has slowed in some regions. The assumption of endless expansion is being quietly tested. And then there is geopolitics. As global tensions rise, defense spending increases. Trade becomes less efficient. Supply chains become more expensive. Fragmentation replaces integration. All of this adds fiscal pressure. At the same time, climate change demands massive investment in energy transitions and infrastructure. That means more spending, more borrowing. So the world stands at a crossroads. On one side, the belief that innovation, technology, and productivity will generate enough growth to justify today's borrowing. Artificial intelligence, automation, new industries, the next productivity boom. On the other side, the possibility that growth remains sluggish while debt compounds. If that happens, something has to give. Maybe interest rates stay structurally higher. Maybe taxes rise. Maybe social benefits are trimmed. Maybe inflation runs hotter than people expect. Or maybe the system simply keeps rolling forward, year after year, refinancing itself, as it has for decades. Here is the strange truth. Debt in itself is not evil. It is a tool, powerful one, can build bridges, fund research, stabilize crises. It can also inflate bubbles and mask structural weaknesses. The real issue is not whether the world borrows from the future. It always has. The real issue is whether the borrowed future is invested in productive assets that generate more value than the debt costs. If borrowed money funds infrastructure, education, innovation, it can expand capacity. If it funds short-term consumption without long-term return, it leaves a bill without an asset. That distinction matters. Right now, many countries are walking a tightrope. High debt levels limit flexibility. A new crisis would require more borrowing, but markets may not be as forgiving. Political polarization makes fiscal discipline harder. Populations expect services, stability, and growth. And investors are watching, because at the end of the day, sovereign debt is a promise. A promise that future workers will produce enough value to honor today's commitments. A promise that central banks will manage inflation without destroying growth. A promise that political systems will remain stable enough to tax and repay. If those promises hold, the machine keeps humming. If they crack, the consequences ripple globally. We have seen glimpses of this before. Sovereign debt crises in emerging markets. The European debt crisis. Currency collapses. Bond market panics. Each time, policymakers intervene. Liquidity is provided. Confidence is restored, at least temporarily. But each intervention often involves more debt. More pulling from tomorrow. So here is the paradox. The global economy depends on borrowing from the future to sustain the present. Yet the sustainability of that borrowing depends entirely on what the future becomes. It is a feedback loop built on expectation. And expectations can shift faster than balance sheets. The uncomfortable math is not just about trillions of dollars. It is about time. About whether the next generation will be wealthier, more productive, more innovative. Because if they are, today's borrowing may look like a smart investment. If they are not, it may look like a burden quietly transferred without consent. We rarely frame it this way. Politicians debate budgets. Analysts debate interest rates. Markets debate inflation. But beneath all of it lies a simple reality. We are living, in part, on income that has not been earned yet. That can be visionary or reckless. It depends on what we build with it. So the next time you hear about rising deficits, new stimulus packages, or trillion-dollar spending plans, do not just ask how much is being borrowed. Ask a harder question. What kind of future is being purchased with that debt? And will it be strong enough to pay us back? If you found this breakdown useful, take a moment to like the video and share the channel. It helps us continue unpacking the systems that shape your money and your future. Because the world is still borrowing. The only uncertainty is whether the future will be generous enough to keep lending. And that brings us to the quiet tension at the heart of it all. The world keeps borrowing. The markets keep lending. The system keeps rolling forward. Calm on the surface. Complex underneath. The only open question is whether the future we are building will be strong enough to carry what we have already placed on its shoulders. If you found this breakdown valuable, please take a moment to like the video and share the channel with someone who wants to understand how the financial system really works. Your support helps us keep creating clear, honest explainers like this. Thank you for watching.